So in this video, we're going to be looking at this 15 marker. Situation ethics can solve the moral problems raised by voluntary euthanasia and assisted suicide. So the first thing we need to note here is that the question isn't asking you to just apply situation ethics in a really general way to voluntary euthanasia and assisted suicide. The question wants you to evaluate and make a judgment as to whether situation ethics can solve the moral problems raised by voluntary euthanasia and assisted suicide. So to score highly, we need to show that we're clearly addressing this focus in the question. So let's have a think about what some of the moral problems raised by voluntary euthanasia and assisted suicide actually are. So here are 3 of them, and there are obviously more, but here's just 3 to get you thinking. So firstly, should people have the right to end their own life? Secondly, is the quantity or quality of life more important? And thirdly, the slippery slope. So would legalising voluntary euthanasia and assisted suicide in the case of terminal illness potentially lead us down a path to allowing it in non-terminal cases? So those are 3 moral problems raised by voluntary euthanasia and assisted suicide. The question, as you can see here, also wants you to solve those moral problems. It's asking whether situation ethics can solve those moral problems. So what would that even mean? What would it mean to solve these moral problems? Well, to solve means to find an answer to. Okay, so in other words, what this question wants us to do is to say whether situation ethics can find an answer to these problems or problems like them that are raised by voluntary euthanasia and assisted suicide. So essentially what you can do is you can almost like reframe the question to help you understand what the examiner really is looking for. So the question says, situation ethics can solve the moral problems raised by voluntary euthanasia and assisted suicide. What that really wants you to do is think about whether situation ethics provides a clear answer to the moral problems that relate to voluntary euthanasia and assisted suicide, such as whether people should have the right to end their own life, or whether legalising voluntary euthanasia and assisted suicide for terminal illnesses could lead us down a path to allowing it in non-terminal cases. So remember, what this question wants you to do is to think about whether situation ethics provides a clear answer to these kinds of questions, to these moral problems that are raised by the issue. So, of course, what we want to do is try and aim to be scoring in level 5. What that means is we need to show from the outset that we're giving a very well-focused response. So that means establishing a clear thesis. So you need to decide what you will be arguing and why. You need to show the examiner that you are clearly addressing the specific question that they have set, and that can help you meet that very well-focused response criteria. So here we have an example of an opening paragraph. What I want you to note here is the bit in red where it's clearly focused on the question, and the bit in blue where there's a really clear thesis with a reason given. So let's have a read through. It says, voluntary euthanasia and assisted suicide lead to several challenging moral problems. Note the link to the question there, such as whether people should have the right to end their own life, and whether legalising voluntary euthanasia and assisted suicide for terminal illness in the UK could lead us down a path to allowing it in non-terminal cases. Then we move on to the thesis section. I believe that situation ethics cannot effectively solve these problems because as a teleological relativist approach to ethics, it does not provide clear answers to moral issues. So hopefully you can see there how it's clearly focused on the question, and also that there's a really clear reason given with support. So in the main body of your essay, what you want to do, of course, is to have a discussion. So you need to discuss different views. So essentially, you need to support your thesis and then counter the view. Okay, so in one example, okay, to support the thesis, you could say that situation ethics can't solve moral problems raised by voluntary euthanasia and assisted suicide because, and then you give your reasons. And then of course you're going to counter that by saying, although it can't solve the moral problems, maybe it provides guidance that can be applied to individual cases. So I want you to notice that in both of those kind of starter sentences, how I've linked back to the specific wording in the question. I've used the words solve, moral problems. So I've used those words, those three words, showing the examiner that I'm really focusing on the question that's been set. Now, to try and make sure that we get to this critical analysis part of the criteria, what we really need to do is to make sure that we don't present one view and then present another in isolation. What we really need to do is kind of interconnect the different perspectives. So use one view to counter the views of another. Try to show the weaknesses in the different views that you share, and that can really help you with the critical analysis element. So you can see here, if we're going to counter the view, although situation ethics cannot solve the moral problems, it provides guidance that can be applied to individual cases. I'm then going to show some critical analysis by saying, is this guidance really useful though, since it is relative to individual cases? So hopefully you can see there what critical analysis looks like in practice. So the next thing we're going to have a think about is how you're going to show the examiner that you are evaluating. So the third level of the level 5 criteria highlights the importance of appropriate evaluation that's fully supported by reasoning. So a good way to show that is to include mini conclusions or interim judgments at the end of each section. So you can see here an example of what that might look like. Therefore, it seems clear that situation ethics cannot solve the moral problems of voluntary euthanasia and assisted suicide because. So at the end of each section, you need to be linking back to your thesis or to the question. So a top tip is to make sure that in every paragraph or every section of your work, it's possible for somebody who doesn't study RS, for somebody who doesn't know the topic, to be able to read that section and to know what the question is and what your argument is because of the repetition of kind of key phrases that are related to the question. So it should be super clear. Obviously, you also need to make sure as part of the evaluation that you've got a really clear conclusion at the end of your essay that sums up the evidence that you've presented in support of your thesis. That's really important as well.